Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Gaspar, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to point out that you may type any questions you may have at any time, and there will be a time at the end of the webinar where we will answer a couple of these questions that you might have. I'd now like to introduce our presenter. Rick has over 30 years of experience in technology and software. In addition to operating an IT organization focusing on business process consultancy, implementation, and custom development, he has served in a management role in 3 separate business application software companies. I'll turn it over to Rick from here.
Thank you all for being here today. And hopefully this is going to be informative for you. I'd like to go through a brief agenda so that we can stay on track as we move through, and then I'll get right into things. So first thing I'm going to discuss is some first principles. What are some of the foundational things that we have to really consider when we're looking at a build or buy or any kind of software decision. From there, I'll go right into process and talk about the process of actually analyzing and going through this determination. We'll look in depth at costs and risks and try to balance those out. And then I'll go right into some build and buy examples. My intention here is really to present an even and unbiased look at this process and to provide a whole series of tools and thought processes that you can use to actually go ahead and move along with a software build or buy process as we go. So I'd like to start with a few first principles, and one really important one here, and that is that your data is going to outlive your application. Be very, very aware of that when you start any process like this. The information that you collect is most likely, especially in the situation of cemeteries, where we're often talking about hundreds of years of information. The information that we actually put into the system is going to be around long after an individual computer product or an individual piece of software or any application that you develop is there. So it is very, very important that you get it right when you move forward, so that the data can travel over time, through a variety of systems and things like that. So always be aware of that when you start. And I think the way to do that is to focus on a few things. First, defining your purpose in a clear and concise manner. What am I going to do with this information? How am I going to use it? That can have a lot of determination as to how you structure the information. But then the second question is actually even more important. Are there other purposes for which this data may be used? When you consider that, it may change the way you structure that information. And I'll give you a good example in a couple of minutes. So what do you do to make sure that you can address these things? The first and most important thing is to follow good data discipline in building the information, considering different ways that it might be used, considering, what are the smallest units of information that you may use, and appropriately defining things like the fields. Do I put separate first and last name field, separate rows and sections and grave numbers and things like that. Those can be critical, and they may take a little more time to do, but they can make the data much more useful. Second thing is to set up data validation rules. What does good data in this field look like, and how should it be? Third thing is to make sure you define the relationships among the data and essentially build out tables so that you can define that. And then you want to consider, how is it going to be used? How is it going to be shared across a group of people, or is this going to be single use? One thing that I'll say up front with this is, if you don't have the expertise to make these determinations, get it. Get some help from a consultant or get something like that, because the last thing that you want to do is get it wrong. I'll give you a good example of this right now. I was working with a local public library a little while ago, and they had gone through a multi-year project to transcribe several hundred years of cemetery burial information. The librarian, who was thinking that this is going to be used for genealogical purposes, had a single field for location, a single field for name, and a single field for date of death. The volunteers who started transcribing this information were given the ability to put anything they wanted in it. So we had information like under the old oak tree, because that's what was in the original burial record, or in the Jones family plot. And then under names, we had William A. Smith, in parentheses in the same field, son of Jacob. So that data, nice and searchable for genealogical purposes and things like that. But to actually use it in a cemetery management system where we had to define out where actual locations were, who people actually were, was almost useless. There were no easy rules that we could apply to break out that information because it was done free form by different users, on data that had been created over time, and there was no real structure to it. So considering your structure is really important. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask our first poll question, and see where we can go from there.
I'd like to remind everyone that you may type any other questions you may have in addition to the poll question down below in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end.
Great. So I'll move on a little bit, and we'll get this poll question off the screen so that we can work through this process a little bit more. So in doing this development, it's very important to to have a process, and the first part of that process is really defining your minimum acceptable system that you are going to need to address your issues. So in doing that, first thing to consider is, what is the real problem that we want to solve or the goal that we want to achieve? And really focus on it and try to be singular in that, focus on one big thing to start. Identify who your key required users are for this minimum acceptable system. Who are the people that actually absolutely need to have access to this information, that actually absolutely need to put information into this system. And then what is the must-have information that they need? Are they just burial records? Are they ownership records, for example, and things like that, and really define those out. The next thing to look at is workflows. And what do you want to do with this information? How do you want to transform it and move it? So, what are those must-haves that you have as well? Because when it comes to workflows, workflows are really where you can get a lot of return on investment out of things. And I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. A very important thing to look at is the availability of your source information, and how you are going to get that into the system. If all your records are in paper, if they're in logbooks, if they're in things like that, how are you going to get those into a structure and a format where you can actually use them in a digital system? And then last and most important thing to define is, along with your goals, what is the minimum acceptable return on investment that you're going to have for this project? How am I going to pay for it? How am I going to potentially, make money or save time or do things like that? And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that as we go on. So your first step is to do that for the minimum system that you think you might need. The next step is to then take a little broader look, define your ideal state or your desired result. So in this case, you're starting with that minimum acceptable system, and you're going to a broader list of problems, pains, and aspirations. Do you want to be able to manage cemetery maintenance in it? Do you want to be able to generate contracts? Do you want to do things like that? And look at the users who could benefit from that system. Who are the people in my organization that, if I had a little broader definition, might actually be able to to benefit from that. As opposed to just the minimum workflows that we need and the minimum information, let's look at the desired information. How much information do we want to collect? How do we want to transform and use that information? What kind of steps and what kind of processes do we want to work on for that? And then from there, also look at potential integrations. So how do I want to share this information, potentially among other software applications and things like that? So once you have this information, it's really useful to go in and start defining success matrix for each feature that you have. And how would you define success? Well, what kind of information would you want to gather? What kind of return on investment might you want to get from it? What kind of time might you want to save? What kind of information do you want to have? And spell that out for each feature, because it can help you in making decisions as to what's important, what's valuable, and what isn't later on. And then look at, then say, okay, what are other areas where I can get return on investment if I expand this project and do things like that? So as you do that, you're going to end up with a desired state, and that desired state can start really driving some of the decisions and some of the analysis that you do in working on this project. So now that we have all of those things. We want to do some quantification here. One thing we want to do is quantify and validate our opportunities for return on investment. So, and we want to look at, how, again, how can I pay for this? How can I structure this so that we get value out of it for both that minimum acceptable system that we first defined and then the individual components of that desired state. Now, we're going to share this information after the webinar here. I'm not going to go ahead and read through everything on this list, but I'll just point out a few things. So, some of the return on investment things that you can gain are actual hard dollar benefits. An increase in sales by X. I'm going to increase my transaction value by doing this. I'm going to be able to cut down the labor required to do things by a certain amount. I'm going to have more time to spend on family service and care of those people as I take the drudge work out of it. So those kind of benefits. Then we can focus on, as you see, those start to get a little bit softer. And then, even some of the very soft benefits that can be hard to quantify, but it's a good exercise to try. Building my brand, improving my image, reducing risk, which can be quantified in some ways with cost of insurance and things like that, and the amount of trouble that you're taking fixing problems compared to where you can get. So do as good an analysis on this as possible, because what you tend to find out when you do this is that there are some places where you can get some really strong return on investment. You may have the data to do it and the information to do it. It might not have been the first things that you thought about, but they can actually drive the project. Now, sometimes the initial cost of that project may be higher to do that, but when you're talking about multiples of return on investment, it changes the decision from a price or this is the minimum I have to do, to this is the most I can get and the best results I can get from it. So we determine the return on investment. We also want to determine costs. So if we look at purchase systems, the costs are pretty clear. You're going to get proposals from your vendors, licensing costs, host and hardware. Sometimes you're going to be charged for upgrades or things like that. Make sure that you have that included in your costs. One of the challenges that people tend to leave out is the project management and the resources internally, whether you're doing a internally developed project or even if it's external. There are a lot of resources required within your organization to make things happen. And sometimes you're going to be pulling people off from family care. You're going to be pulling people off from finance or front desk work during that project to actually get some of this work done. There's a cost associated with that, so make sure that you quantify that. Things like the implementation of the system, even with an out-of-the-box system, getting the information that's specific to your organization, and getting the workflows put in there and things like that. They take time and they have costs. All of those things are also there for internal development, but there tend to be a lot more costs associated in some cases that people leave out. Specifically, project management is usually an even bigger process then. You still are going to usually have hosting or licensing or hardware costs associated with the thing. If you're using a piece of software to build your application, that's going to have fees associated with it. Next, you're going to look at development and implementation costs, and those can be quite significant as well. And usually they tend to be where people focus on the cost, leaving off a lot of these other things. And the big one that is almost always left off is quality assurance. As you're developing your own system, you got to make sure it works. You have to test it out. You have to test it out over time, because things are going to happen as the software evolves. And you have to make sure that any workflows, any data that's entered is entered appropriately. The desired results are coming out of it, which involves a lot of testing. Even in small systems, you're very often going to see 60 or 70 minor errors from the way from the way screens are displayed to the way things are calculated that may need to be fixed. And some of them can be a big challenge to work on. And that doesn't mean you're done either, because things change over time. You have to consider change management. You're going to have to consider this both with the purchase system or internal development. But change can be a huge impact when you have an internally developed system, especially if you used a contractor to do the work or something like that, and you need to go back to them for a separate engagement every time you have to deal with changes. Training and support are issues in both cases, but you're going to have to do all of that internally when you develop an internal system. And they have to be ongoing. Your staff is going to change. You're going to have new people involved in many cases. And one big one that people tend to leave off is security as well. And we'll have a whole totally separate slide on security, and we'll discuss that. Then the last thing for an internally developed system is succession. Typically when you develop a system internally, there are a few people who have the knowledge of that system, how it works, how it's supported, and things like that. And I'll talk in a lot more detail as to what happens if those resources become unavailable. So with that, we'll get right into talking about costs and risks, which are very similar in all situations. I'm going to go ahead and ask a second poll question here that we can take a look at, and we'll go from there right into this.
And as well, for the people who recently joined, if you have any questions at any point in time, or any of this you'd like to learn more, you can just use the chat feature below and ask a question.
Great. So I'll let that poll run for a little bit, and I'll try to get it off the screen so we can actually see this piece of information, but it's actually really important. One of the first things to really look at is security and privacy. One of the big challenges that we're dealing with right now is that the number of states with data security and data privacy laws has doubled from 2016 to 2018. And even among those that already had them, they've tightened up those regulations to involve more and more people. As we start dealing with that, there's some really significant challenges that you're going to deal with. First, maintaining compliance is not an option. That you can very well run into situations where your system is not going to be compliant with current regulations, and you're going to have to make changes. That can be a consideration definitely in situations where you are developing your own system. We'll talk a little bit more depth about that. But it can also happen in situations where you have a small vendor, for example, with minimal resources, that has developed an external system, even a hosted system, that isn't being kept up to date as far as security and privacy requirements. Some of the examples that we'll often use. The state of California has the California Consumer Protection Act, which is taking effect in January of 2020. It is very, very rich in terms of requirements for how you handle security on your data. Now, in the cemetery world, we're going to say, well, we've only got dead people in the system. It doesn't matter. In a lot of cases, that really isn't true. If you are selling plots, if you keep track of next of kin, and not everybody that's going to be in that system is dead, you will most likely be subject to the data privacy laws. And the easiest way to maintain that is to look at an existing system that has very robust capabilities in terms of being flexible with privacy. I mentioned the California law. We also have another one that people said that, well, maybe this doesn't apply to us, but it is the European data privacy regulation that are often referred to as GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation. It applies to European citizens and European residents. And especially if you're in the northeastern United States or out in California or Texas, it is highly likely that you have European citizens and European residents in your databases as next of kin, as plot owners, as many things. Those regulations apply to you today. So are you prepared to deal with them? Have you even done the type of analysis that's necessary to, to do that? So, there's something really significant to consider, and can be a big issue. A lot of people will say, fine, I'll just keep the system on premises. Well, is an on-premises system really more secure? The question I would ask you in that case is, do you have data privacy and data security professionals that are working day to day in your internal systems? If the answer to that is no, you are probably at a much worse risk than an organization that doesn't. because most breaches of data today come from social engineering. Clicking on something, getting a virus in your system, accidentally handing over a password to somebody that that you believe is actually there to help you, and those things happen every day. And as long as the system is connected to the internet in any way, there is a very good chance that you are exposed in those situations. Do you have the resources to manage that and do it actively? Do you have the resources to get penetration tests of your internal networks done on a regular basis to make sure that you don't have breaches? If not, that's something that can definitely change the equation to say, well, maybe I should buy a system that has those features. And again, be very, very careful in selecting your vendor in those situations, because some systems may not have the appropriate privacy capabilities that you need. So the next thing to consider in the cost and risk area is workflows. And again, I said a little bit about workflows before. They are the process of executing steps with data validation to replace manual process steps. So, examples of that are, the ability to collect information and have it produce a cemetery contract or something along those lines. When you have those built into your systems, they're usually the biggest source of return on investment. You're making sure that your data is correct, using it for purposes that can actually that can actually generate revenue and generate information for you. Having customer relations management built in so that you can keep track of the people who are interested in plots or the contact work that your staff has done with them. All of those things require a lot of work, because it's not just a matter of putting things in a spreadsheet or putting things in a database and managing that data. It's managing the data, how it moves through the system. If you're considering developing those on your own, one of the things to consider is that the development of workflows can take at least 5 times the amount of time as setting up those the data sources that they're going to work with. So, so there can be a really significant time sink into doing those. Even more important, quality assurance and making sure that the things actually work the way that you want them to gets harder and harder the more workflows you have. In fact, it'll increase exponentially with the number of processes that you want to automate. So do you have the resources available to handle that quality assurance? Again, if you're looking at an off-the-shelf system, typically a lot of those vendors will have robust quality assurance processes and things like that to test the workflows and to test that work before they roll it out to your system. Last thing to consider there is that workflows change. Over time, you're going to have better ways to do things, different ways to do things, different people involved, and you have to be able to respond to that. You don't want to lock your business and lock your business functions into static workflows that were built into a system because that's the way we've always done it. It can get very expensive to stay in the dark ages by doing that type of thing. So when you look at that, successful workflow implementation is going to generate improved return on investment. So so the more that you can do with workflows, the more return on investment you can get from them. The challenge becomes, do I have the development ability, the quality assurance ability, and the change management ability to do that? So the question to ask here is, can you define and execute on your workflows? If not, you may want to consider a purchase system. If yes, or if you can keep them to a minimum, building a system may very well work for you. So another thing to consider is user experience. So reality is it's not a solution if nobody uses it. And when you look at a poorly designed solution, users are really reluctant to adopt that. But in addition to what we call the user interface, there are other issues I'll get into in a couple of minutes. So if you have an easy to use system, it's going to generate user and feature adoption. So users are going to want to use it. They're going to use all the features of that system. Right? So that can be a very important thing when you're working on those things. And how do you do that? There are certain things out there. There are software and internet best practices. Essentially, those memes or those things that we do and we absorb automatically because everything else does it the same way. So when we're looking at software and internet best practices, most people know how to make a purchase on Amazon because it's intuitive and it's simple and it walks you through the process, right? So it uses appropriate workflows. You know, the screens and the buttons are things that people are used to seeing. And those all come from a series of best practices and things that people are familiar with. Now, do you have the ability to, and the knowledge to adopt those throughout your software development or your project development to make sure that people are going to not run into problems and not stop when they come to the first issue? You know, additionally, things like putting help or information on individual fields, having clear help guides and things like that built into your system. Those types of things can make it easier to use and make it easier for people to continue to use. But they do also require resources to develop. So you want to make sure that you're able to do that. Another thing to consider is industry best practices and workflows. So, there are best ideas and best ways of handling things that are, that are developed in an industry, and when executed on can make your business processes easier. Things like how to walk through a contract and get it legally signed, for example, when you're selling cemetery plots. You can try to develop those on your own, or in addition to that, you can go ahead and utilize software that has these best practices built in. So do you have the ability to understand best practices? Do you have the desire to adopt them within your business to potentially gain more efficiency than you already have? Or on the converse, I'll ask, do you have a better way of doing things than most of the industry does that you might want to develop your own system to do? So you can see that things will swing in both ways in that case. Also, when we're dealing with cost and risk, user role configuration can have a lot. Is your software rich enough that I can show people only what they need to use and not present them with more information than they need? So if the software is capable of saying, okay, somebody in maintenance is going to need to see this, somebody in sales is going to need to see this, somebody managing the front desk at the cemetery is going to need to see this, and present only that to them, it's much more likely that they're going to use it. And then making sure it's all documented is very important, producing documentation within the software and even classical user manuals. That also has an expense to it. So then when you look at that, if your users fail to adopt the system, you get no ROI or negative ROI from it. So questions to ask here are, will your staff use it? And can you get new staff started easily? The next thing to consider is support. And this tends to be the most underestimated requirement when people are looking at building their own systems. Now, users are going to have general ongoing operating questions. They're going to need problems resolved. Staff is going to change, and you're going to have to train those people. You're going to have to adapt as external rules and regulations and vendors, even things like that, change. As things like the change from to a lot more preference for cremation happens. Your systems are going to have to be able to adapt to that and respond to it. And then you're also going to have to support infrequently used features. Sometimes those infrequently used features generate the highest return on investment, but people never use them because they don't know how to get to them or they don't remember how to get to them in the system. You've got to support that. An example I have here is I've seen a lot of systems. I've been into multiple cemeteries in the last 6 months where people have purchased a system that they intended to use to manage contracts, burials, ownership, and everything else. When you actually look at what they're using it to collect on receivables on term contracts because that's the one thing they remember how to do in the system. It's the one thing they do. They're feeling that they're getting some kind of return out of it, but they're getting a fraction of the return that they would have gotten had they been able to access and use and understand the other features that the software had. So it's a big risk that you run, that you're going to use a very small fraction of what you have because you don't have the appropriate support. So, when you look at that, who's going to answer the questions and resolve the problems? Is it going to be somebody internal? Is it going to be a vendor? Do you have the budget to handle that? Now let's look at integrations. Do you need to, if you're developing a system like this, does the information need to be shared with other applications? The easiest way to do that, and the way a lot of people do it, is they will hand key the same information into multiple places. But that has its own issues. When you're dealing with other applications, realize that everything is a moving target. every application that you have is going to change over time. The operating systems that they run on, Microsoft's going to make changes, Apple's going to make changes and things like that. And you have to be able to adapt to those changes. Usually when a change like that is made, systems break and they have to be fixed. So some things that you have to make sure that you have are good data and process validation rules built into your software so that it can make sure that, that things are happening right. The other really important thing is auditability. As I'm transferring information from one system to another, can I verify that it happened correctly? Do I have proof of that? And all of that. Now, one of the tools that people tend to use to communicate between applications, so we call application program interfaces, or APIs. And an API allows the interchange of data between one piece of software and another. They're actually very powerful tools to allow you to share information, but you have to be really careful with them because they are automatic, but an API will very often bypass the workflows and data validation rules built into your system. So bad data can get fed between one system and another very, very easily. And certain required workflows, certain required checkpoints and things like that may get skipped over when you utilize an API to move information. So another big challenge very often is that you won't necessarily have an appropriate log to maintain the auditability when you use an API. But they can, when done correctly and when actively monitored on a regular basis, they can provide a very powerful way to interchange information between your software. Next thing to consider is, you can also move information by importing and exporting information between applications. Usually then you're going to have an audit log because you generate your export file or your import file, and it's going to tell you exactly what you have. But the challenge there is, well, it can be very, very accurate, be very auditable, and it can be very easy to change if your applications change. It does very often require an additional step. That step can sometimes be automated, but very often it happens automatically. So when considering all of that, and how am I going to share information among applications, there is another option. And that's going with a broad-based application that can be a single source of truth. So if all of the information that you need, all the processes you need, or a good chunk of them are contained within a single piece of software, in that case, you don't have to worry about how am I moving data among things. So an example of that in Cemetery, if your same system manages your contracting, your burials, your maintenance, your collections, and your mapping, it's all within one system. You can save all of that. So the question you have here is, can you support the required integrations? Are they necessary, or is there actually enough data moving that maybe a manual process might be better? And what are those other alternatives if I don't need to integrate? So another huge risk is what we call the never-ending project. And when we take a look at internally developed software projects, about 70% of them historically are abandoned before they actually go live or get heavily used. And a lot of that is just due to the amount of time that it takes to happen, and the actual poor management and poor definition of the project initially. So how can you avoid this? One of the first things to do is we talked about the minimum acceptable system before, establish absolute clarity on what that is and work toward that. Then you produce a very detailed definition, scoping, and understand the resource allocation for producing that minimum acceptable system. In doing that, you now have some clarity to move forward, and then you start making some decisions about that. You can look at that minimum acceptable system and evaluate the return on investment for it. So you can compare that to the resource requirements that you have. So I can get this return on investment, but it is going to cost me this much in resources to do it. Does it turn out that that project is worth it? Does it turn out that there might be a better way to do it? If you are doing something extensive that way, make sure to employ professional project management to handle the performance milestones and the objectives. And if you're using a custom developer to develop that system for you, I'd recommend that person not be employed by the developer. A little different situation if you're using an off-the-shelf piece of software with implementation, because the project managers that handle implementation for a off-the-shelf package have a lot of experience in in what the milestones are, what the requirements are on both sides, and can help manage that. But if you're looking at your own system, make sure that you have a good, solid third-party project manager to handle the process if it's complex enough. Yeah. Then as you do this, I've talked about doing it for the minimum acceptable system, but also do the same thing for, and do the same analysis for any potential enhancements that you'll have in that system. And lastly, one of the big warnings is prevent scope creep. Everybody always has new ideas as that project is going on. Let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. The more new ideas that you introduce during the development of the initial project, the bigger that project's going to get, the more complex it's going to get, and the less likely it's going to arrive at that completion milestone. So until you get to being able to harvest the return on investment from your minimum acceptable system, don't bring anything else on. So the question here is, can you get the project over the line? And one of the bigger challenges with internally developed projects, and even in some cases with heavily engineered off-the-shelf projects, is succession. So I asked this question before, but if your project leader, developer, or sponsor was incapacitated, who would take over? And what kind of process do you have to handle that transition? So you run into a lot of risks when you run into this situation, because there are often multiple people. There is the project leader, the developer, the key users and things like that. If the absence of any one of them would put the project at risk, you have to have planning for who is going to succeed them. And not only planning, but you have to execute on that. So some of the things that you can do to protect that is document. So as you're defining your system, define that design and document that design. Why did I do this? What is going on here? As software developers are developing a system for you, if you're developing something internally, make sure that that code is heavily commented and has explanations as to what everything does. So if another developer had to step in, they would be able to figure out what's going on. And take a close look at that, because a lot of times we have non-native English speakers that are developing these things, and you want to make sure that their comments and things like that make sense if you were to turn that over. Document your workflows as well. Why am I taking these steps to create a contract? Why am I doing this calculation this way? Produce that documentation. That's a good idea, even if you're implementing a workflow in an existing system. Document your security. How is this protected, and what kind of processes, what kind of ongoing things do I have to do to maintain the protection of this system? And then have a successor handoff plan. Okay, for each one of these key people involved in the project, how are we going to hand things off if something was to happen to them? And even more important, work on knowledge transfer prior to that happening. So make sure there is a backup, and a backup that is trained, and a backup that's capable of stepping into that role if you have it. And then maintain your documentation over time. Things will change. And something I can guarantee you, because I've seen it 100 times in my career, is that projects with no succession plan will eventually die a sad and expensive death. Because something as simple as the developer passed away, and the administrator password was with him, we have no idea what it was, can kill your project. So make sure that you confirm your succession resources and the costs associated with them. So with that, I'm going to go quickly into giving you some examples of some projects and some different alternatives for that. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to go ahead and ask the third poll question for you. And give you a couple seconds to work on that. Okay, so while you're answering that, I'll start talking a little bit about some examples. Now, there are times when it makes a lot of sense to build a project. There are times when it makes a lot of sense to buy software, and I will go ahead and give you some examples as to that right now. So really the first example of when should I build something is when you have a small records management project. If if you're dealing with simple data structures, you know, the example of those historical burial records that I gave you, you know, could be one where there's really not much workflow that needs to be developed. You just want to capture the information. You're going to have limited users, and they're going to have limited functions in the system. It might be just looking things up. And then you have the resources to get that data entry in there. Great time to actually build your own. Again, you know, go back to the beginning of what I suggested here, and you know, use good data management practices in designing this, and you can actually get a project like this over the line very often pretty easily. You know, you can get, because it's not going to require a lot of resources, you can get, you know, some quick return on investment. For example, you can reduce the retrieval times on records, you can prevent data loss and things like that. You know, they're not big changes, but they're the kind of things that, because of the limited scope, the limited ROI is worth it, and then potential risk mitigation is worth it. And there's minimal downside risk in doing a project like this. So another type of thing another situation where you might want to build something is if you have a unique competitive advantage that you can express in software. So that might be a particular way of calculating out financing, or a particular way of managing trusts, or something along those lines. And the expression of that unique competitive advantage is unavailable commercially. You couldn't use a piece of standard software to do it. You also, in a situation like that, because it is essentially a trade secret, you don't want to share it with external developers or things like that, so it gets out in the wild and diminishes your competitive advantage. If you're going to develop something like that, you know, you know, the security and privacy reasons of it are the first reason that you'd want to do it. But then in that case, stick to the solution and keep it simple. As you start to try to focus on integrations and things like that, you may get data leakages that will diminish that competitive advantage. So consider, you know, maybe we can just manually enter some of that key information and still get a benefit. So things like calculators, like the finance calculator that I mentioned, things that aggregate and collect information and use it in a unique way, or similar systems like that, are the kind of things that can give you a unique competitive advantage that you don't want to share with people. They're trade secrets, and by putting a system together, you can gain, enhance, or maintain that competitive advantage that you have. But if you're going to do things like that, protect it with encryption, digital watermarks, intellectual property registration where applicable, although trade secrets you have to manage in different ways, and things like non-disclosure agreements among the people who are actually going to use that within your organization, so that you can maintain that competitive advantage. When it comes to buy it, there are a lot of things to consider. Now, the first thing is, you know, is an off-the-shelf solution for what I want to do available? Now, if it is, very often one of the big benefits I'm going to get is year-over-year predictability of the expense. So if I'm looking for, I have to have a budget item, I have to know what it's going to cost, an off-the-shelf system will do that. There are many less variables like ongoing support, succession, things like that, that you have to manage very heavily with an off-the-shelf solution than there are when you go to something that's built internally. If you have limited internal resources or expertise, an internal or a purchase project may be the way to go. You know, one thing that we find with most of these projects that we're doing in cemeteries is that the organizations don't have a lot of people available to handle everything from data entry to even describing exactly what they need. If you don't have the people to do it, you can almost be assured that a build it project is going to fail, even if you employ an external developer. Even when you look at purchasing a system, you have to be prepared that there is going to be a resource drain inside your organization during the process of doing it. So another reason to consider buying is if you desire to adopt industry and software best practices in your operations, you know, to be able to take advantage of things that you may not be doing right now. Very often, you know, with the right system, you can find, you know, systems that have those best practices built in, and you can start to use them right away. You do have to consider change management there, because people in general are resistant to change. So, you know, how are you going to manage them being changed? And the one I've bolded here is the need to realize a timely return on investment. You know, off-the-shelf projects are predictable. So based on that, you can determine when and how that return on investment is going to come in. You have a cost associated with it that is usually fixed or calculatable, and then you can start to take advantage of the return on that over an appropriate amount of time. If you've got concerns over usability or user adoption, a good pre-developed system can be a great way to go. Now, if your solution is going to include workflows or business processes, those can be very difficult to develop internally, things like contract management, trust management, commission payments, things like that we tend to run into in the cemetery industry. Those can require a long time to develop. Off the shelf, you can get them pretty easily. Then also be aware that if the complexity of your project exceeds the available resources, which I've sort of said several times within this slide, might be a good time to actually consider purchasing a system. And then lastly, be aware of return on investment. If the maintenance resources for an internal project would consume any return on investment, which very often happens if you use the model that I put there and evaluate all of your costs, you're very often going to find that. The chances that you won't need as many maintenance resources and will be able to achieve return on investment are very often greater, especially as the complexity of the system goes up when you purchase a system. So when we take a look at buying, there are a couple different types of systems you can get. A highly configurable system, a customized system, and one that just is what it is, or a static system, which I'm not even going to include here, that's going to have just a basic set of capabilities that you can choose to use or not use the way they are. So in general, you want a system to either be configurable or customizable. A configurable system is going to have a lot of different options that you can select from to establish or to match up with the business processes that you need. In general, they are fairly easy to implement. They are very flexible. And they are very upgradable and enhanceable over time, because the software itself doesn't have to be changed, to make a change in configuration. So configurable systems allow simple change over time. But the one challenge they have is that you have some very specific needs. You may not be able to address them within the configurations available within that system. When you run into those situations, it can be a very good time to evaluate your own business processes. Is this business process a competitive advantage? Is it something that is important to us? Or potentially maybe want to go ahead and change it and adopt a best practice that's available within the system. Now, a customizable system would be a system that essentially establishes a core set of features, and then they're able to modify that system through the code and actually build out your system from the customizable system. They can be a good option when you're actually considering developing a system and you have a lot of unique needs, but they're very specific to your organization. They're very, very specific to your practices and things like that. They can start with a core system. They can go ahead and code and develop and customize the things that you need within it, so that you're able to address your needs a little more specifically. Biggest challenge with a customized system is that once it departs from the core system, it essentially becomes the equivalent of your own internal customized system. That means it freezes in time. So as they start making other changes to that customized system, add features and do things like that, you may not be able to take advantage of those features because yours is frozen in time at that point. Expenses for change can be very, very similar to a system that you've built yourself, because they're going to have to come back in every time you need a change. You're going to have to employ the developers to go and make those changes and do things like that. And the bigger challenge is they become very difficult to support for the developer over time, because the developer may be able to provide a general level of support, but to have personnel that stay with them over time, that know exactly how your system was changed or altered, can be really difficult. Typically with a customized system, they have a life cycle of 3 to 7 years. At that time, usually you have to do an all-out change in that customized system, replace it either with a new version with all the customizations redeveloped from your initial developer, or sometimes moving into something else. So be aware of the life cycle of a system like that. Configurable systems can grow and change with you over time, and as you get farther out into them, usually you will be able to adapt. So another build-it example is really when we deal with the big guys. If you have internally developed systems that are large and codependent, meaning that the information between them has to be exchanged, and you have a full development resource, a full training resource, a full document resource, and not just a guy, but a department that handles these things, and that department is appropriately funded to stay with you over time, that is another time to consider building your system. You're already working with built systems. You already have the resources in place to do it. You have the depth of staff to assure succession. Then you really start focusing on the return on investment. Again, they're going to be developing things that may already exist in a current system, and you have to be aware of that. So when you're looking at that, even as a big guy, have you really considered all the costs? And will this turn into one of those never-ending projects? So a couple other options we can do as well. So we can, in addition to building or buying, we also have the ability to downscale our project. So as opposed to building a large system, let's just identify the smallest capability that represents the greatest result and redefine your minimum acceptable system. So a great example of this in cemeteries is, very often people have this great idea of transcribing all their records, putting them into a database, and and creating a searchable database of all their records, when the real intention is to preserve the documents. So in a situation like that, as opposed to a records management system, consider a document management system. Just get all the images scanned. You can still locate them sequentially throughout the file. It can be very easy to retrieve them compared to going through paper files. And it does establish a permanent offsite, secure solution. So sometimes downscaling may be the way to do it, maybe the one way to handle that resource crunch problem. Another thing to consider is, do I want to start small and then grow with it? Advice over time on this projects is that they tend to have the biggest risk of failure. If you start small, usually your initial design isn't going to accommodate expansion because you didn't have the time or the resources to consider how I'm going to expand that. You may not have additional resources to grow it over time. And you run a very big risk, like that library did, of the initial data being unusable when you make the decision to expand. So most start small projects are going to remain small. So if you're going to do that, which falls in with downscale, assume that I'm just solving the small problem. Others are abandoned completely and replaced by larger systems. It's very rare that you see those good intentions of starting with a small problem and expanding it are going to end up with appropriate results. So a third alternative is definitely something to consider. Do nothing, right? If after looking at all of this, the problem isn't big enough to invest in resources, or that the resources themselves are not really available. So in a lot of cases, consider, I need to convert my data into a digital format. We just don't have the resources. There's nobody there to type it in, right? Well, we're probably not going to get anywhere with a project like that. Another big situation to run into is, very, very often in the cemetery world, people are very used to having done things the same way forever. So your staff is pretty set in their ways. If you don't have staff or user support to get a project done, it's not going anywhere. People will resist. So make sure you evaluate that, and that might trigger you to say, okay, maybe for now at least, until Mary retires, we're going to do nothing. Right, so always something to consider along those lines. And then the other piece is that if your cost of conversion is too high to achieve return on investment, I've seen cemeteries where they've started to get their lot cards transcribed, and the net cost of transcribing lot cards on a 100-year-old cemetery was about $6 a card. Considering the amount of times that data was going to be retrieved, every individual retrieval would probably work out to $18 to $20 over the life of the project, because it cost them so much to get that data entered. So be aware of that when you're doing things. And I'd say that project definitely had a negative return on investment. So in a situation like that, the easiest way to avoid a failed project is to do nothing. So hopefully I've given you a good overview and you know, generated a little bit of a thought process for you here to consider whether you should build, buy, or even other alternatives when it comes to your cemetery software. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And you know, I deliberately did not come to any conclusions here because there is no one right answer. And I'd like to go ahead and answer a few questions here.
So we do have a question already, but I will give you guys a little bit of time to type in any other additional questions just before we get into that. So the first question we have is, what suggestions do you have around evaluating current processes and finding what is best for us?
Sure. That one really comes around process. So you know, one thing that I will be able to provide for you is some checklists and things like that after this. So if you go ahead and respond back to your initial invitation for this, and we'll go ahead and put some contact information on the screen, I will, you know, I'll give you some tools for doing that. But again, it's breaking it down into a few things. So start with that minimum acceptable system. You know, and taking a look at, you know, what is it that I want to do, you know, and then you will compare that to the processes that you have right now. One thing that I would highly recommend in all these situations is that if your current processes are paper-based or things like that, be really willing to change those processes for things that might be a better practice. And so you'll run into things like, you know, contracting. You know, in the case of contracting, if you're pulling out paper forms, you know, filling in those forms, and then going and entering them into another system, which has or multiple systems, an accounting system and some kind of database that have equal chances of creating errors and things like that, that's a place to look at consolidating. So the best step would be to, you know, I usually don't recommend trying to evaluate everything you do. Select a process that you think you can improve. Start with that. Then expand that beyond that minimum acceptable system into other individual processes and work to do those, as opposed to trying to say, you know, how can we do this whole thing at once? What we tend to find as we go through a lot of these evaluations is that they turn into what we refer to as day forward projects. For example, if your cemetery is active and you are still selling plots and things like that, you know, you may not want to bite off the big process of getting all of your historical information in the system. You can get almost immediate return on investment by coming up with a good way to capture the information, generate contracts, generate deeds, and then track burials moving forward. If you focus on that piece of the process to get started, then work on backfilling other things that can give you additional information. Another one is maintenance. If you have issues maintaining maintenance orders and maintaining family requests for maintenance, you know, focus on that and build the system around that ability first. You know, usually if you're working with a vendor, they will have other suggestions for you and other ways to focus on things. The biggest killer in these things is to say, I need to get all of my data for all of these things into the system. Yeah, very expensive process generally with often minimal to negative return on investment.
So we have another question here asking, how do we find a consultant?
So if you're considering developing something on your own, there are local IT organizations that may be able to help you. You know, and I would suggest if you are a local organization working with somebody local in a situation like that, you know, so either look up software development, database development or something like that, if you are planning on doing that. If not, I'd suggest engaging with several vendors like us at Plotbox. You know, we can at least help you through the beginning parts of the project and help you determine whether, you know, there's a good fit for what we can do for you, or whether potentially you may need to, you know, to get some things developed. We can provide a lot of clarity in doing that for you as you move forward.
The other question that we have also kind of ties into that. It's asking if there was a minimum size cemetery that is appropriate to look at buying a system. I
would say less than size is transaction volume is a big determiner. In that if you have a historical cemetery where you are not actively burying and there are not active changes in it, no matter what you do, there is going to be a cost associated with nothing more than a negative return on investment. Family service is something that I haven't really focused on a lot here is a really important thing, and the ability to service families can be big, but if you are in a historic cemetery, I would suggest working on a minimum type project. If you are active, there are really a couple of factors there. One would be number of burials, and the other one would be your average grave price. Those are going to help determine what percentage of revenue might be worth doing it. Typically you're going to see returns on investment of from 5 to 20% on what you're doing. So, if you're looking at something that would potentially cost you 20% of revenue, you're going to have a challenge with return on investment with that. I think one of the things that people tend to make a big mistake with is looking not to spend enough money to solve the problems that they need, because low investment results in low return on investment as a general rule. So you have to be a little bit careful with that.
All right, so I think to be respectful of everyone's time, we'll end the session now. Thank you so much, Rick, for your time. And I hope everyone has a good day.